Case 1, Justine M. Johnson. The cartoon told me to. There is a particular kind of horror that settles over a courtroom when the details of a crime are so incomprehensible that silence falls not from decorum, but from sheer disbelief. That is exactly what happened in Iosco County, Michigan, during the trial of Justine M. Johnson, a case that prosecutors, child welfare workers, and criminal psychologists have described as one of the most disturbing child homicides in Michigan's modern history. Sutton Mosser was 3 years old. 3 years old. She had a name. She had a face. She had the kind of innocent, boundless trust that only very small children carry. The absolute, unquestioning belief that the person who tucks them in at night will still be there in the morning. Sutton had no reason to believe otherwise. She was home. She was with her mother. She was supposed to be safe. On September 16, 2021, Justine M. Johnson stabbed her 3-year-old daughter 17 times. 17. Forensic pathologists who conducted the autopsy documented the wounds methodically. Stab wounds covering Sutton's tiny body. Wounds that spoke not to a momentary lapse of control, but to sustained, deliberate violence against a child who could not fight back, could not run, could not understand what was happening to her, or why the person she loved most in the world was hurting her. When law enforcement arrived at the scene in Iosco County, they found Sutton dead. They found Justine Johnson. And when investigators began asking questions, they received an answer that stopped the room cold. Justine Johnson told police that a cartoon character told her to do it. She specifically named SpongeBob SquarePants, the animated television character from the long-running children's cartoon, as the entity that had instructed her to kill her daughter. She described experiencing what she characterized as hallucinations, claiming the cartoon figure had communicated with her and directed her actions on that September evening. Now here is where this case becomes not just tragic, but forensically and legally complex in ways that take it beyond a simple headline. The defense leaned heavily into Johnson's reported mental state. They argued that she was experiencing a genuine psychiatric episode, that her claim of hallucinations was consistent with an undiagnosed or untreated mental illness, and that she therefore could not be held fully criminally responsible in the traditional sense. Prosecutors pushed back with everything they had. The prosecution argued, and ultimately convinced a jury of, the position that regardless of what Johnson believed she was experiencing, the evidence showed deliberate, sustained, repeated stabbing of a defenseless 3-year-old child. 17 stab wounds is not a moment of madness. 17 stab wounds is 17 separate moments. 17 individual acts of violence against a little girl who weighed less than 40 pounds. The jury found Justine M. Johnson guilty of first-degree murder and first-degree child abuse. The verdict was unequivocal. In March of 2023, Iosco County Circuit Court, Judge John Glazer sentenced Justine M. Johnson to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She will never leave prison. She will die inside those walls. Sutton will never grow up. She will forever be 3 years old, frozen in time while her mother is frozen behind bars, and the rest of the world tries to make sense of a crime that defies every natural instinct we carry as human beings. What investigators and prosecutors repeatedly emphasized in the aftermath of this case was the absolute necessity of taking early warning signs seriously. In many child homicide cases, there are precursors, moments where intervention could have changed everything. Where a phone call, a welfare check, a neighbor's concern could have placed a small child somewhere safe. We cannot know with certainty whether that was true in Sutton's case. But we know with absolute certainty that when she needed protection most, she did not receive it. Sutton Mosser deserved to grow up. She deserved kindergarten and birthday parties and the chance to decide for herself who she wanted to be. None of that was given to her. Rest in peace, sweet girl. If this case moved you, if it made you want to make sure stories like Sutton's are never forgotten, please hit the like button right now, drop a comment below with Sutton's name to honor her memory, and subscribe to Cold Case Revisited so you never miss a single story. These children deserve to be remembered. Help us make sure the world doesn't forget them. Case 2, Mitchell Blair. The Freezer. If you have followed true crime in any serious capacity over the past decade, there is a reasonable chance you have heard the name Mitchell Blair. And if you have heard it, there is an equally reasonable chance that it has stayed with you, lodged in the part of your memory that holds the things that are hardest to process, hardest to set down, hardest to explain to someone who has never heard the story. Because this case is not simply disturbing. It is one of the most profoundly evil domestic child homicide cases in the history of the state of Michigan, and arguably one of the most harrowing in the entire modern history of American crime. Mitchell Blair was a Detroit mother. She lived in a city housing apartment on Detroit's east side with her 4 children. From the outside, neighbors described her as private, strict with her kids, demanding. Those words, in retrospect, were catastrophic understatements. What was happening inside that apartment was a sustained campaign of torture and murder that lasted years. And it was happening to children. Stephen Barry was 9 years old when he died sometime in 2012. His mother, Mitchell Blair, later confessed that she killed him after accusing him of sexually abusing his younger siblings, an accusation that investigators were never able to independently verify, and that was made entirely by Blair herself, giving herself a justification that she constructed for her own purposes. Blair subjected Stephen to sustained torture before his death, burning him with scalding water, forcing him to stand in cold showers for hours, depriving him of food. When he died, Blair did not call for help. She did not tell anyone. She placed her 9-year-old son's body in a plastic bag and put him inside a chest freezer in the apartment where she and her remaining children continued to live. And then she did it again. Stony Blair was 13 years old when she died in 2013. Mitchell Blair's own daughter. Stony died under similar circumstances, subjected to abuse, accused by her mother of the same alleged conduct that Blair had accused Stephen of, and killed. Her body was placed alongside her brother's in the same freezer. For approximately 2 years, Mitchell Blair's other children lived in that apartment, went to sleep at night with their siblings' bodies in the freezer, were present in that space, were subject to whatever psychological terror that reality imposed on them, whether or not they fully understood what was in that freezer. The case broke open in March of 2015, not through a welfare check, not through a neighbor's tip, not through anything that resembled the systems that are supposed to protect children. The bodies of Stephen and Stony were discovered by eviction workers. Blair and her remaining children were being evicted from the apartment. Workers arrived to remove belongings and discovered the freezer. When they opened it, they found what had been hidden there for years. Mitchell Blair was arrested. What followed in interrogation rooms and ultimately in a Detroit courtroom was a confession that was extraordinary in its emotional range. Blair described herself as a protective mother, as someone who had done what she did to shield her other children, as a person who had acted in response to a threat. She showed remorse at certain moments and defensiveness at others. She described the killings with a disturbing level of detail that confirmed the sustained nature of the violence. She pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder. She was sentenced in July of 2015 to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She will never be released. The surviving children were removed from her custody. The psychological damage done to them, children who lived with their murdered siblings' bodies, is something that no sentence handed to Mitchell Blair can undo or address. What makes this case particularly important from a systemic perspective is the question that hangs over it like a permanent shadow. How did 2 children die inside a Detroit apartment, with their bodies stored in a freezer for years, without any system? No school, no welfare worker, no neighbor, no official of any kind, detecting that something was catastrophically wrong. Stephen Barry was 9 years old. He was at an age where he should have been attending school. His absence should have been noticed. His absence should have triggered questions. The systems failed, and 2 children paid for that failure with their lives. Stephen Barry, Stony Blair. Say their names. Please like this video to help these children's stories reach more people. Subscribe to Cold Case Revisited and ring the notification bell. We will never let these victims be forgotten. Leave a comment below. Their names deserve to be spoken. Case 3, Shanda Vander. 70 pounds of suffering. There are cases in true crime that are physically difficult to research. Not because the facts are unclear or the documentation is thin, but because the facts themselves, the documented, verified, court-confirmed facts, are so relentlessly brutal that getting through them requires a kind of deliberate emotional steadiness. The case of Shanda Vander and her son Timothy Ferguson is one of those cases. Timothy Ferguson was 15 years old. He had disabilities. He was dependent on the adults in his life for his most basic needs: food, warmth, mobility, care. He was, in the most literal sense, completely vulnerable. And the person responsible for providing everything he needed to survive chose instead to take it all away, systematically and with extraordinary cruelty, over an extended period of time. Shanda Vander lived in Norton Shores, Michigan, in Muskegon County, with Timothy and her adult son, Paul Vander Arkansas. What happened inside that home over the months leading to Timothy's death in 2022 is documented in extensive trial testimony, forensic reports, and the statements of investigators who described the scene they encountered as among the worst they had ever witnessed in their careers. Timothy Ferguson died of starvation. That is the medical and legal baseline. When his body was found, he weighed 69 pounds. 69 pounds at 15 years old. For context and comparison, the average healthy weight of a 15-year-old male is somewhere in the range of 120 to 140 pounds. Timothy weighed 69 pounds. His body was consuming itself. His organs were failing. He was, in effect, being killed by the slow withdrawal of the single thing every living creature requires to survive, food. But the starvation was only the beginning. Court testimony and prosecution evidence documented a catalog of additional abuses that Timothy endured in the months before his death. He was subjected to ice baths, forced into freezing water as punishment. He was made to consume hot sauce as a form of torture. He was physically restrained, handcuffed, according to evidence presented at trial. He was denied sleep. He was denied basic hygiene. He was isolated. He was punished for behaviors related to his disabilities, behaviors that he could not control and that no child, disabled or otherwise, should ever be punished for, let alone punished in ways that constitute criminal torture. Paul Vander Shanda's adult son, was also present in the home and was tried separately. He was convicted and sentenced as well. But today's focus is on the woman who, as Timothy's mother, carried the primary legal, moral, and human obligation to protect him. Shanda Vander went to trial in Muskegon County. The prosecution presented a case built on medical evidence, witness testimony, and the devastating physical record of what Timothy's body had endured. The defense attempted to offer alternative explanations and context for some of the evidence, but the jury was unconvinced. Shanda Vander was convicted. In January of 2024, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for Timothy's murder, with an additional 50 to 100 years added for the first-degree child abuse conviction. The sentencing judge, by all accounts, made clear in open court that the nature and duration of the abuse left no room for leniency and no basis for any sentence other than permanent incarceration. She will never leave prison. Timothy Ferguson spent the last months of his short life in conditions that no human being, let alone a 15-year-old child with disabilities who depended on those around him for everything, should ever be subjected to. He deserved food. He deserved warmth. He deserved someone who would look at his disabilities not as an inconvenience to be punished, but as a reality to be accommodated with love and patience. He deserved a mother. He got a torturer. For Timothy, please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Revisited. These stories need to be told. These children need to be remembered. Your engagement helps this channel keep telling the truth. Thank you for being here. Case 4, Mia Morrow. 31 pounds. Some cases break your heart in a single statistic. In the case of Mia Morrow and her son Jackson, that statistic is 31 pounds. 31 pounds is the weight at which Jackson Morrow died on May 3, 2022 in Berrien County, Michigan. He was 8 years old. He was autistic, and he weighed 31 pounds. To put that number in human terms, the average weight of a healthy 3-year-old child in the United States is approximately 31 to 32 pounds. Jackson was 8. He had grown to the age of 8 while his body was reduced to the size of a toddler. The forensic and medical evidence presented at trial told a story of prolonged, severe starvation, not a sudden deprivation, not a brief crisis, but an extended, sustained withdrawal of adequate nutrition from a child who had no means to seek food for himself, no way to call for help, and no understanding of why the adults responsible for feeding him were not doing so. Jackson was autistic. His autism affected his ability to communicate, to advocate for himself, to make his needs known in ways that the adults around him might have been forced to acknowledge. He was, in every practical sense, entirely dependent on his parents for survival. His parents were Mia Morrow and the boy's father. Both were charged in connection with Jackson's death. The prosecution's case centered on the argument that Jackson's death was not the result of an unforeseeable medical crisis or a condition that appeared suddenly. His condition, the catastrophic loss of weight that left him at 31 pounds, developed over time. It was visible. It was documentable. It was the result of choices made by adults who were present in the home every day and who chose, repeatedly, not to provide what Jackson needed. One of the most damning details that emerged during the investigation and prosecution of this case was the timeline after Jackson's death. According to evidence presented in court, after Jackson died, his parents waited approximately a full day before contacting emergency services. A full day. During that time, the body of an 8-year-old boy who weighed 31 pounds remained in the home while the adults who were responsible for his death determined what to do next. That detail, that delay, was used by prosecutors to underscore the consciousness of guilt that they argued was central to understanding what had happened to Jackson. Mia Morrow was convicted and sentenced in March of 2023 to 25 to 50 years in prison. It was not a life sentence without parole, but it was a sentence substantial enough to potentially result in her spending the remainder of her most active years incarcerated. Her appeal was heard and subsequently denied in December of 2025, with the appellate court upholding the conviction and the classification of Jackson's death as a homicide. The case prompted immediate and extensive public discussion in Berrien County and across Michigan about the adequacy of child welfare monitoring systems for children with disabilities, particularly children with autism, whose communication barriers may make it more difficult for outside observers to detect abuse or neglect. Jackson's disability did not create his vulnerability. The adults in his life created his vulnerability by choosing their own priorities over his survival. Jackson Morrow was 8 years old. He deserved to be fed. He deserved to be seen. He deserved to reach 9 and 10 and 20 and to live whatever life his magnificent, complicated brain had in store for him. He deserved a mother who loved him enough to feed him. Like this video for Jackson. Subscribe to Cold Case Revisited. Comment his name below. Let's make sure the world knows Jackson Morrow existed and that his life mattered more than his death. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss a story from this channel. Case 5. Jennifer Crumbley. The parent on trial. This is the case that changed American legal history. Not because Jennifer Crumbley personally committed the act of violence at the center of this story. She did not pull a trigger on November 30th, 2021. She was not physically present at Oxford High School in Oakland County, Michigan, when 4 students, Hannah St. Juliana, Tate Meyer, Madison Baldwin, and Justin Schilling, were shot and killed by her 16-year-old son, Ethan Crumbley. She was elsewhere, and yet she stood trial, and she was convicted, and she was sentenced to 10 to 15 years in a Michigan prison. And in doing so, Jennifer Crumbley became the first parent in the history of the United States to be convicted of involuntary manslaughter for a mass shooting carried out by their child. Let that settle for a moment. First in American history. To understand why, you have to understand the full weight of what the prosecution documented and what the jury ultimately accepted as the truth. This case was not about a parent who simply didn't notice warning signs. It was about a parent who was directly shown warning signs, who was given explicit opportunities to intervene, and who chose, again and again, to do nothing. On the morning of November 30th, 2021, Jennifer Crumbley and her husband James Crumbley were called into a meeting at Oxford High School. School counselors had discovered a disturbing drawing that Ethan Crumbley had made, a drawing depicting a gun, a shooting victim, the words "the thoughts won't stop, help me," and references to violence. This was not a vague or ambiguous signal. This was a child screaming for help through paper and pencil in the most direct visual language available to him. During that meeting, school officials expressed serious concern. Jennifer and James Crumbley declined to take Ethan home. They declined to seek emergency mental health evaluation for their son. They returned to their separate activities. Ethan Crumbley returned to class. He had a loaded handgun in his backpack, a handgun that his parents had purchased for him as a Christmas gift less than a week earlier, on November 26, 2021. Hours later, Ethan Crumbley opened fire in a hallway at Oxford High School. The prosecution's case against Jennifer Crumbley rested on 2 pillars. First, the purchase and unsecured storage of a firearm that was legally accessible to her minor son. Second, and perhaps even more damning, her presence in that school meeting on the morning of the shooting, her awareness of the severity of the warning signs presented to her, and her failure to remove Ethan from the environment or seek the help that every piece of available evidence screamed he desperately needed. Prosecutors also presented extensive evidence about Jennifer Crumbley's activities in the hours after the morning school meeting, activities that demonstrated she was engaged in her own personal priorities rather than concerned with the escalating crisis in her son's mental state. Text messages and other communications were presented at trial that painted a portrait of a mother who was disengaged from her child's deteriorating mental health in ways that went well beyond ordinary parental oversight gaps. Jennifer Crumbley's defense argued that she was not the proximate cause of the shooting, that she could not have known with certainty that her son would carry out a mass murder, and that holding a parent criminally responsible for the independent criminal act of their child sets a dangerous legal precedent that could expose countless parents to prosecution. The jury rejected that argument. After deliberating, they found her guilty on all 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter, 1 count for each student killed. In April of 2024, Jennifer Crumbley was sentenced to 10 to 15 years in prison. Her husband James Crumbley was convicted and sentenced separately on identical charges. Hannah St. Juliana was 14. Tate Meyer was 16. Madison Baldwin was 17. Justin Schilling was 17. For young people who went to school on an ordinary Tuesday in November and never came home. For families whose lives were permanently shattered. The Crumbley verdict will be debated by legal scholars for years. It raised genuine and important questions about the boundaries of parental responsibility in criminal law. But what the verdict also said, loudly and clearly, is this: when you are shown that your child is in crisis, when you are given every possible opportunity to intervene, and when you choose to look away, there are consequences. There must be consequences. Those 4 Oxford students are owed that much. If this case made you think, made you feel, made you want to talk, please like this video and let us know your thoughts in the comments. This is one of the most legally significant cases we have ever covered on Cold Case Revisited. Subscribe for more stories that matter and hit that bell so you are always first to know when we post. Case 6. Irene Whitehead. Twice. Sometimes the question that haunts investigators, the question that follows them home at the end of a shift, that wakes them at 3 in the morning, is not how. The how, as terrible as it is, can be documented, processed, filed into the architecture of a case. The question that truly haunts is the simplest and the most devastating. Why? In the case of Irene Whitehead of Cedar Springs, Michigan, the answer to that question remains, as of this recording, something that courts and investigators are still working to establish. But what has been confirmed, what is on the record, documented, verified, and publicly available, is devastating enough on its own. Riley was 2 years old on September 3, 2025. She was Irene Whitehead's daughter. And on that day, according to a confession that Whitehead gave to investigators, she suffocated her. Kent County law enforcement responded to Whitehead's home in Cedar Springs following a report of an unresponsive child. When they arrived, they found Riley. Emergency efforts were made to save her. They were unsuccessful. Riley was pronounced dead. During the investigation that followed, Irene Whitehead spoke to investigators. And what she told them expanded the case in a direction that no one could have anticipated, a direction that transformed an already devastating child homicide into something almost incomprehensibly worse. In her statements to investigators, Whitehead confessed not only to the death of Riley but to the death of another child, a son named Leo, who had died in 2021. Leo was 2 months old when he died. At the time of his death had been ruled a natural infant death. It had not been investigated as a homicide. It had been closed. For approximately 4 years, the death of 2-month-old Leo Whitehead had been categorized and filed as a tragedy, terrible, but natural. The kind of loss that happens sometimes, heartbreakingly, to very young infants. Whitehead's confession changed everything. Leo's case was immediately reopened. The circumstances of his death were re-examined in light of his mother's statements. Irene Whitehead was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for Riley, 1 for Leo, along with first-degree child abuse charges. She was arraigned and held without bond. The community of Cedar Springs, a small, close-knit city in Kent County, was shaken by the charges in ways that small communities experience this kind of news differently from larger cities. Personally, neighbors who had seen Whitehead, who had perhaps waved hello, who had no framework for understanding what was allegedly happening behind closed doors, were left trying to reconcile the ordinary face of a neighbor with the charges in front of them. As of this recording in early 2026, Irene Whitehead's case remains in the pretrial phase. Trial has not yet been concluded. She has not yet been convicted. She is legally presumed innocent until proven guilty by a court of law. But the charges she faces, 2 counts of first-degree murder, carry mandatory life sentences in Michigan if she is convicted. And the confession she gave to investigators, which her defense will need to grapple with, looms over every stage of proceedings to come. 2 children, 2021 and 2025. For years apart. 1 investigation. 1 confession. Riley and Leo deserved everything this world had to offer them. They deserved to grow up, to be loved, to become whoever they were going to become. That possibility was taken from both of them before either of them had the chance to understand what the world even was. Their names should be spoken. Please say them, Riley, Leo. Like this video in their memory. Subscribe to Cold Case Revisited and help us keep covering cases like this one. Cases that might otherwise fade from public attention before justice is complete. Leave a comment and let us know your thoughts on this case. We will continue to follow it as proceedings develop. Case 7. Nancy Gerwatowski and Baby Garnet. 25 years in a cold case file. June 26, 1997. Garnet Lake Campground. Mackinac County, Michigan. Northern Michigan. Pine trees. A place families came to camp, to breathe, to get away from the noise of ordinary life. A newborn baby was found dead in a pit toilet at that campground on that June day in 1997. A newborn. Hours, perhaps, from birth. A baby who had barely arrived in the world before being placed in a pit toilet and left to die. Left in the dark, in the waste, at a campground in northern Michigan, on a summer day in 1997. The baby was a girl. She was given a name by the investigators and community members who refused to let her remain anonymous. Baby Garnet. Baby Garnet's death was investigated in 1997. DNA evidence was collected from her body. Evidence was preserved. But technology at the time, the investigative capabilities, the genetic databases, the forensic tools that now routinely solve decades-old crimes, was not sufficient to identify who had abandoned and killed her. The case went cold. Baby Garnet went without justice. For 25 years. 25 years is an extraordinary length of time for an unsolved murder to carry its weight in an investigator's mind. Cases go cold for many reasons. Lack of leads, unidentified suspects, technology limitations, resource constraints. Cold cases become filing cabinets. They become archived boxes. They become the cases that retired detectives still think about. The ones that come up in conversations between old colleagues. Whatever happened with that one? What happened with Baby Garnet was that the world of forensic genetics caught up with the 1997 murder. Through the use of investigative genetic genealogy, the same technology that has solved dozens of cold cases across the United States in recent years, including some of the most high-profile cases in American criminal history. Investigators were able to build a genetic profile from the DNA collected from Baby Garnet in 1997 and use that profile to identify familial matches in publicly available DNA databases. Working outward from those matches through traditional genealogical research, investigators were eventually able to identify a specific individual as the likely biological mother of Baby Garnet. That individual was Nancy Gerwatowski. In 2022, when investigators first identified her as a suspect, she was a Michigan grandmother, a woman who had gone on to live her life for a quarter century since that June day in 1997 when a baby was placed in a pit toilet at a campground in Mackinac County and left to die. Gerwatowski was located, approached by investigators, and agreed to speak with them. She gave a confession. She was subsequently charged with open murder, involuntary manslaughter, and concealing the death of an individual. The legal proceedings that followed were not without complexity. Gerwatowski's defense moved to suppress her confession, arguing procedural grounds around the circumstances under which it was given. Those motions wound their way through the courts, and in February of 2026, an appellate court denied the motion to suppress, clearing the path for her confession to be admitted at trial. The case remains in active legal proceedings as of this recording. If convicted of open murder, Gerwatowski faces a potential sentence of life in prison. The Garnet Lake case carries with it a kind of haunting that other cold cases sometimes do not. The image of a newborn at a campground, the 25 years of silence, the grandmother who lived an entire adult life, while a baby she left in a pit toilet waited in an archive for someone to give her justice. Baby Garnet's real name is not known. She is only the name given to her by people who refuse to forget her. But that name, Baby Garnet, carries a weight that has not diminished in 27 years. If anything, it has grown. It grew with every year the case stayed cold. It grew when investigators refused to close the file. It grew when forensic science finally gave them a path forward. Baby Garnet. Say her name. Like this video to help Baby Garnet's story reach as many people as possible. After 27 years, she deserves a world that knows she existed. Subscribe to Cold Case Revisited and leave a comment below. What do you think about the use of genetic genealogy to solve cold cases like this one? Let us know. Case 8, Sherry Leak. A birthday, November 23, 2025. A date that should have been a celebration. A date that should have been marked with candles and cake and the simple, irreplaceable joy of a child reaching another year of life. 11 years old. A milestone. The kind of birthday that a kid remembers. It was Miala's birthday. Miala was 11 years old. She was the adopted daughter of Sherry Leak of Fruitport Township, Muskegon County, Michigan. And on her birthday, on November 23, 2025, Miala stopped breathing. The details of what happened, as documented in charging documents and court filings that form the basis of this account, are deeply disturbing. According to the information presented by prosecutors, Sherry Leak physically sat on Miala during what is described as an altercation. She sat on an 11-year-old child. The weight of an adult sitting on the body of a child in that manner, sustained over any meaningful period of time, is sufficient to cause catastrophic physical harm, to restrict breathing, to damage internal organs, to create the conditions for death. Miala stopped breathing. Emergency services were called to the Fruitport Township home. Responders arrived and found Miala unresponsive. She was transported for emergency medical treatment. She did not survive. Sherry Leak was taken into custody. She was charged with manslaughter in connection with Miala's death. She was held without bond. A determination by the court that she represented a sufficient risk to the community or flight risk that no bail amount was appropriate. This case, as of this recording in early 2026, remains in active legal proceedings. Leak has not yet been tried or convicted. She is legally presumed innocent until proven guilty. But the charge she faces, manslaughter, and the circumstances described in charging documents, the death of a child during a physical altercation initiated or escalated by the adult responsible for her care, paint a picture that law enforcement and prosecutors found sufficiently clear to support the charges brought. What makes the Miala Leak case particularly resonant, beyond the inherent tragedy of any child's death, is the date, November 23rd, her birthday. There is something about that specific detail that human beings process differently from other facts in a case. The day that should have been for her, entirely, joyfully, uncomplicated for her, became instead the day she died. Became instead the day her name entered a criminal charging document. Became instead the day that the people of Muskegon County who read about it in the local news felt something that probably defies precise articulation. Miala deserved her birthday. She deserved her 11th year. She deserved the 12th and the 20th and every year beyond that. Her next-door neighbors and community members in Fruitport Township deserve to know that if there is a child in their orbit who needs someone to see them, it is never the wrong time to ask if that child is okay. It is never overstepping to pay attention. The systems that are supposed to catch these cases before they become tragedies do not always catch them. Neighbors, teachers, coaches, family members, sometimes they are the last line before the worst happens. Be that line. Like this video in Miala's honor. She was 11 years old, and she deserved better. Subscribe to Cold Case Revisited so you get every update as this case moves toward trial. Comment below. Let us know what this case means to you and what you think about how we protect children in our communities. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. Case 9. Cortney Bartholomew. They were her blood. There are degrees of evil. Most people who study criminal behavior, who spend their careers trying to understand what drives human beings to harm one another, will tell you that categorizing evil on a scale is a fraught exercise, that the impulse to rank atrocities can minimize individual suffering, that every victim's pain is complete and total regardless of where their killer ranks on some theoretical scale. That is true. That is important. And it should be kept in mind as we approach the final cases in this documentary. But it should also be acknowledged that some crimes, when the full weight of their details is absorbed, produce a particular quality of disbelief, a particular silence, the kind that settles not gradually but immediately, the moment the facts are understood. The case of Cortney Bartholomew is one of those cases. Rebecca Park was 22 years old. She was pregnant. She was Cortney Bartholomew's biological daughter, born to her, raised with some connection to her, linked by the most fundamental biological tie that exists between two human beings. And in November of 2025, according to charges filed by the Michigan Attorney General's office, Cortney Bartholomew, along with her partner, allegedly lured Rebecca to their home in Wexford County, Michigan. What happened next, as laid out in the charges and investigative findings reported by multiple verified news outlets including CBS Detroit, ABC News, and the Michigan Attorney General's office, is among the most extreme alleged acts of violence this documentary has covered. According to prosecutors, Rebecca Park was tortured at the home. The duration and nature of the torture, as described in charging documents, reflects a sustained act of violence rather than a sudden, momentary act of rage. She was, according to allegations, held. She was harmed. And then, and this is the detail that removes this case from the category of the merely terrible and places it in a category of its own, her unborn baby was removed from her body. In the woods. By her own mother. Rebecca Park and her baby both died. Cortney Bartholomew and her partner were arrested and charged in December of 2025. The charges filed against each of them were multiple and severe, 8 counts each, all carrying potential life sentences. The charges included murder, torture, and multiple additional counts reflecting the number of distinct criminal acts alleged to have occurred during the course of this crime. Both were held without bond. The Michigan Attorney General's office, which prosecuted the charges at the state level, described the case in press communications as one of the most extreme acts of familial violence they had encountered. As of this recording in early 2026, the case is in the pretrial phase. Cortney Bartholomew has not been tried or convicted. She is legally presumed innocent until proven guilty. But the charges she faces, 8 counts, all carrying life-term exposure, reflect the assessment of Michigan's top law enforcement officials about the severity and extent of what allegedly occurred in Wexford County in November of 2025. Rebecca Park was 22 years old. She was carrying a child of her own, a child who was never given the chance to take a breath or open their eyes. Both of them were taken. Both of them deserved protection that was not given to them. Both of them deserve to live. There is a specific cruelty in what is alleged here. Not just the violence itself, but the architecture of it. The luring. The fact that Rebecca went to her mother. To her mother. Whatever complicated relationship Rebecca and Cortney had, whatever dynamics existed between them, the one thing that should have been certain, the one thing that every human child is born believing at some cellular level, is that their mother is not the source of danger. That their mother is not the threat. Rebecca Park went to her mother. That fact will not leave the people who have covered this case easily. It should not leave any of us easily. For Rebecca Park and her unborn child, please take a moment right now. Like this video. Leave a comment. Subscribe to Cold Case Revisited if you have not already. This case needs continued attention as it moves through the court system, and this channel will be here to cover every development. Hit the bell. Tell a friend. These victims deserve a world that refuses to look away. Case 10, Lisa Holland. The lie that lasted 7 years. We close this documentary with a case that is, in many ways, the original modern Michigan child homicide that shattered public consciousness and forced the state to confront what it was capable of missing for years at a time. A case with roots that stretch back further than most of the cases you have heard today, and a history of systemic failure so profound that it became the catalyst for legislative change in the state of Michigan. A case that, despite the passage of time, has lost none of its power to devastate. Ricky Holland was 7 years old when he disappeared. Not when he died, when he disappeared. Because Ricky Holland's death was not immediately known as a death. For 7 years, from 2005 to 2012, a lie stood in the place of the truth about what happened to this little boy. Ricky was the adopted son of Lisa Holland and her husband Tim Holland of Williamston, Michigan, in Ingham County. He was a 7-year-old child with a history of behavioral difficulties, a child who had already navigated the complexities of foster care before being adopted by the Hollands. A child who had known instability and who, in adoption, was supposed to have finally found the permanence and safety that the child welfare system exists to provide. In July of 2005, Ricky Holland was reported missing by his parents. According to Lisa Holland's initial account to investigators, Ricky had run away. He had a history of behavioral issues, they explained. He was a difficult child. He had simply disappeared. What followed was a months-long search effort, an investigation, media attention, the kind of public engagement that missing child cases generate when a 7-year-old boy vanishes from a quiet Michigan community. Tips were followed. Leads were pursued. The Hollands were interviewed. Lisa Holland spoke publicly about the disappearance of her son, displaying the kind of distressed, searching parental anguish that moved people watching. It was a performance. In 2006, Tim Holland led investigators to a wooded area in Jackson County, Michigan, where Ricky's remains had been concealed. Tim Holland cooperated with investigators and told them what had happened. Lisa Holland, he disclosed, had killed Ricky. She had struck him with a hammer. She had beaten him to death. Tim Holland had helped her dispose of the body. The investigation that followed, and the trial that came next, revealed a history of abuse that Ricky Holland had endured in the Holland household. Evidence presented at trial documented a pattern of mistreatment, physical abuse, isolation, deprivation, that had gone on for a significant period before the July 2005 night when Ricky was killed. Evidence also emerged about contacts with child welfare services during the period before Ricky's death, contacts that had not resulted in the intervention that might have saved his life. Lisa Holland went to trial. She was convicted of first-degree murder and first-degree child abuse. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She has appealed her conviction multiple times over the subsequent years. Every appeal has been denied. She remains incarcerated. She will remain incarcerated for the rest of her life. Tim Holland pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 30 to 60 years. He cooperated extensively with the prosecution of his wife. The Ricky Holland case had consequences that extended well beyond the courtroom. In the aftermath, the Michigan child welfare system came under intense scrutiny. Legislative discussions were initiated about reforms to the Child Protective Services system, about caseload limits, about follow-up protocols, about the circumstances under which a child in a reportedly troubled home situation is visited, assessed, and monitored. Ricky's law, legislation addressing aspects of child welfare and foster and adoption oversight, emerged in part from the public and legislative response to his death. Ricky Holland was 7 years old. He had already survived a great deal before he was adopted. The adoption was supposed to be the end of difficulty and the beginning of something stable. Instead, it placed him inside a home where the abuse escalated until a hammer ended his life on a July night in 2005, and his body was hidden in the woods while his mother stood before television cameras and the world and said that she didn't know where he was. She knew. She has known every day since 2005. She will know every day she spends in the prison cell where she will spend the rest of her life. Ricky Holland. Say his name. Say it for the little boy who ran away from foster care, who was found, who was adopted, who deserved to be loved, who deserved his 8th birthday, and his 9th, and every one after that. Say his name. 10 cases. 10 mothers. 10 children. And in one case, an unborn child who never had the chance to be held, whose lives were ended or forever altered by the people the world told them to trust above all others. This documentary does not exist to sensationalize. It does not exist to exploit. It does not exist to offer comfortable answers to questions that have no comfortable answers. It exists because forgetting is easy. It exists because news cycles move on. It exists because Sutton Mosser and Stephen Barry and Stoney Blair and Timothy Ferguson and Jackson Morrow and Hannah St. Juliana, Tate Meyer, Madison Baldwin and Justin Schilling and Riley and Leo and Baby Garnet and Miala and Rebecca Park and her unborn child and Ricky Holland. Every single one of them deserves a world that remembers their names long after the headlines have faded. There are patterns in these 10 cases that the research makes impossible to ignore. The failure of child welfare systems to intervene before deaths occur. The presence, in multiple cases, of warning signs that were visible but unacted upon. The isolation of vulnerable children. Children with disabilities, children in foster or adoptive care, children whose communication barriers made it harder for them to reach out for help. The time that passed between the harm and the discovery of the harm. The secondary victims, siblings who lived in homes where horrors occurred, communities that were left trying to understand what happened on their streets. None of these patterns are abstract. They are the documented reality of how children die when systems and individuals fail to act. What can you do? Start by paying attention. Start by being the neighbor who asks if everything is okay. Start by being the teacher who notices that something seems off. Start by being the family member who follows up on a concern rather than deciding it's not your place. Start by supporting child welfare reforms in your community and your state. Start by following channels like Cold Case Revisited that refuse to let these stories disappear. And start by remembering the names. Sutton, Stephen, Stoney, Timothy, Jackson, Hannah, Tate, Madison, Justin, Riley, Leo, Baby Garnet, Miala, Rebecca, Ricky. Say them out loud. Say them to yourself. Say them to someone else. Make sure the people in your life know that these names matter. That behind every true crime headline is a human being who had a name and a face and a future that was taken from them. That is why we do this. That is why Cold Case Revisited exists. And that is why we will be back.